has all its naughty bits hung out on the front.
Some people say it's a sort of religion.
You're very lucky and privileged to own one.
They were built like bathtubs on wheels.
You have got a delightful habit of stopping on you.
And it goes like the clappers. Ah!
Well, my grandfather, HFS Morgan, was the son of a rector in Herefordshire. But he had very much an engineering bent, and he in fact went to Swindon, to the Great Western Railway, to train as a railway engineer, and then came back to Malvern and ran a bus company. And the challenge in those days really was getting over the Malvern Hills, which he had to do on a regular basis to get back to Herefordshire, where his father, the rector, lived. And he thought he could build a vehicle that was capable of going up and down the hills better than anybody else, and he did that.
My father had the great advantage of being both an engineer and a businessman, which really was very unusual because you get a lot of clever engineers, but when it comes to business and marketing, what they make and what they can produce and design, it doesn't always work out.
Well, I was 9, unfortunately, when he died, but I did know him quite well. And I knew him as a hugely inventive, very funny, very, very warm character who really looked after me. So it's personal memories I've got. I mean, he used to give me a new dinghy every time I went to stay with him, which I thought was particularly generous. And he made toys as well. He made a pedal car from scratch. I think his real interest was in designing and making things. The first Morgan three-wheeler was a very simple design, but it had some great features to it. Perhaps the main one was power-to-weight ratio. He actually got an engine from Peugeot, which wasn't that powerful, but he made the car as light as he possibly could, even to the extent of having rather clever devices like the chassis tubes carried the exhaust system. He then put the engine in front of the two wheels, and he put himself behind the two wheels, so all the weight was balanced over those two wheels. And not only that, the two wheels in 1909 had independent suspension, so it rode beautifully over the bumps. Because it was a single-seater, it didn't really catch on. But he had a lot of people come up to him and say, make that a two-seater, and, you know, it'll be a real success. And so that's exactly what he did. In 1910, he took the two-seater version to Olympia. I think he got about 60 orders in the first day of the show. And Mr. Burbage of Harrods, who was the managing director of Harrods at the time, said, I've got to have that in my shop window. And it's, I think, the only car ever to have been in the shop window of Harrods.
My present three-wheeler is a 1928 Aero Super Sports. It has a Blackburn engine, 1096 water-cooled engine, and 2 speeds. It has virtually no suspension, rather fewer wheels than many people would expect. It has all its naughty bits hung out on the front, which isn't usual. It appeals to people very often who've ridden motorcycles, and everybody looks at them and thinks, wow, what on earth is that? A very simple construction, which was very effective. I mean, they were sort of virtually put together by blacksmiths, and certainly there was nothing a blacksmith couldn't mend. And they went ever so well, and Henry Morgan did a lot of trials and reliability trials in the early days, and I think it really sort of came to fruition when the Morgan won the Amiens Cycle Car Grand Prix in 1914, and that was it. That was when it really took off.
And after that, of course, the successes at Brooklands of the three-wheeler almost meant that it was too good for its particular classification. So much so that, in fact, it was asked to start in the 1100cc class, the lap behind the equivalent cars. And they did, in fact, ban three-wheelers from Brooklands in 1922, ostensibly because there was an accident at the chicane. But everybody secretly thinks that it was because they were a bit too fast and they were winning all the races.
I used to race when I had more Sundays off, or could get more Sundays off, and I had an F-Type then, which had the four-cylinder Ford engine. And of course that was expendable, but the present one I haven't raced because the engine isn't expendable. It's quite an unusual engine, and if I blew it up I'd be really stuck, I think. Some people wouldn't think that a Morgan three-wheeler was beautiful. I mean, they were built like bathtubs on wheels, and they looked really, I mean, totally styleless, but they had a sort of integrated feel about them. I suppose the character of the thing, which is very direct, and you're close to the ground, the wind's rushing through your hair, but you've also got to like a bit of pain as well when it's raining or when it's snowing. You've got to be able to keep up with the maintenance, so you've got to be a person who sort of fiddles around with things and prepared to get dirty fingernails. It's quite a job sometimes getting ready for communion on Sunday morning. But
well, the three-wheeler Morgan had its heyday after the First World War and in the early 20s. And at that time, the factory was pushing out 40 to 50 cars a week, which makes our current production look rather lame in comparison. But it was affordable, it was sporting, and it benefited from quite cheap taxation as well. Having only 3 wheels gave it a huge advantage over the four-wheeler in terms of road tax at the time.
if I looked at the essence of Morganeering from a religious perspective, I'd say it's sort of like being David and Goliath sort of thing. That there you are in a very small and improbable-looking car, and it'll do what an awful lot of cars, much bigger and much more expensive, won't do. And I think that was always the case. They go like the clappers, they handle really well, and they're sort of so individual.
During the 30s, the three-wheeler went slowly out of favour. I think part of the reason for this was because obviously four-wheelers were being manufactured in mass production plants. But also, of course, people's expectations of comfort went up enormously. And as a result, my grandfather, I think, realised that the twin, sporting as it was, probably needed a bit more comfort. And to that end, he ended up building the last line of three-wheelers, which were the F-types.
This is a 1935 Morgan F4. Uses the Ford 1172cc 10 horsepower engine. The handling is not so good as on the twin cylinder ones, mainly because the weight distribution is different, having the engine behind the axle line rather than ahead of the axle line and a longer wheelbase. So although load performance is good compared with a lot of cars, the general handling I never feel is as good as on the two-cylinder sports models. Having doors doesn't help, makes the whole car more flexible, and nothing with doors is as good as one without doors. It was a good seller in the 1930s. Brought in some new customers who thought it was more car-like and perhaps a little bit more manageable for the average driver. Three-wheels are enough because they don't fall over. You've got to try pretty hard to turn a Morgan over. Some people have managed it, but general load manners of the three-wheeling are very good. I had the first Morgan in 1960, the 1928 family model, and that needed a lot of spares, so we found another one which the chap wanted to swap for a shotgun, but I paid him £10 instead of a shotgun, and we dragged that home. But that was a different model, so that didn't really provide spares for the family model, so we then needed spares for two Morgans. So We then acquired another one that was spares for one of the others, but that was different again. So we finished up with 3 Morgans all needing spares. And that's how the collection really got started, was dragging home piles of wreckage and eventually restoring them over the last 35 years. Just get hooked on Morgans and that's it, really. I don't know, I just got to keep doing them. Some people say it's a sort of religion. You just got to keep rebuilding Morgans. If you don't rebuild another one, you take one apart and start again.
I think my grandfather realised that even with the new F-type three-wheeler, the days of the three-wheeler were a bit numbered. And he'd always wanted to do a four-wheeler. In fact, he'd done a tubular chassis four-wheeler back in 1914. But he, in fact, ended up basing the first Morgan four-wheeler on the F-type series, so it had the Z-section chassis. And that, of course, was the Morgan 4.4 of 1936 with the Coventry Climax engine.
The car is a 1938 Morgan 4.4 Series 1 coupe. And between 1938 and the outbreak of the war, around about 50 were built. And although some people used them in competition, for the most part, they were really used as a much more sedate country doctor's motor car or something like that. The cable brakes are entertaining because you rely obviously on the friction, but sometimes the friction will stay on one side, so the next time you apply the brakes you're pulling to the left, and the time after that you pull to the right. They have got a delightful habit of stopping on you, simply because they get so hot sometimes that the fuel evaporates. People who have an interest in the very early 4.4s, whether it's a coupe or a roadster, are probably the sort of people that also like taking cold showers. Someone once said that everything on a Morgan is adjustable, and therefore it's always in a state of being adjusted. There's no getting away from it. It is not always an easy matter to get the car from A to B over a long distance. You have got to accept the fact that something might well go wrong. But perhaps that's all part of the charm of it. I mean, this is 1930s motoring. This is not 1990s motoring. I'm afraid to say that any young lady who expects to turn up in her latest fashionable clothes, looking neat and tidy after a damn good shower of rain, she's certainly going to hate the car. There's no getting away from it. I mean, this particular model is one of the prettiest cars that the Morgan factory have ever produced. Originally, the car was restored very much with gloss, glamour, and prestige in mind. But then one weekend I saw an advert for a club trial, and I had absolutely no idea what a club trial was. And I went along and I saw these chaps driving in and out of trees, and it seemed an awful lot of fun. Went and joined them and never looked back.
The Morgan Plus 4 was introduced in 1951, and it originally had the Vanguard engine, but latterly it had the Triumph engine. But right from the start, it gave the four-wheeler Morgan a lot of torque and quite a bit of extra power. So it was successful, particularly in rallies at the start, and latterly some quite interesting international competition, with particularly Chris Lawrence running at Le Mans in 1962 and winning the 2-litre class against the Porsches. My father, Peter Morgan, used to regularly do the RAC rally as well as the other major international rallies at the time.
Competition is always important, but I personally am not convinced whether competition with some vehicle which doesn't resemble your road car or the car that people buy at all means very much. Personally, it doesn't mean much to me, and unless one can compete with a car that the public could say, gosh, that's like mine, you know, I've got one of those. That's what is necessary, I think.
And in America, in SCCA racing, a man called Lou Spencer completely dominated the 2-litre class with a Morgan, which he called Baby Doll. There was Baby Doll 1, Baby Doll 2, Baby Doll 3, and Baby Doll 4. But they regularly saw off all the opposition in sports car racing in America, and led, in fact, to an enormous following for the Plus 4. I think at the end of the 60s, a lot of the sports car manufacturers were taking different directions. Some people had seen in the American market, for example, that people wanted a slightly softer, more comfortable car. So things like winding windows, dare I say, and electric windows even, were beginning to be asked for.
We were doing quite well with the Plus 4, but of course things changed, and we were no longer able to get the 4-cylinder TR engine, which we used. With the consequence, we had to look out for another unit, and it just happened that the Rover engine that was offered to me was highly suitable for the car.
The Plus 8, introduced in 1968, the performance was fairly shattering. I remember the motor and autocar figures being something like 0 to 70 in 7 seconds, which for those days was quite quick.
Morgan, not surprisingly, in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, were marketed as simple, straightforward sports cars. They weren't unlike visually the MGs and the HRGs of the period. However, when we get to the 60s, particularly with the launch of the Plus 8, you get a complete change. Morgan became a fashion accessory. Their sales material and their literature garishly coloured. No reference to tradition, no reference to pedigree, and indeed by buying a Morgan, you were probably suggesting at that time that you were buying something, yes, unusual, but you were buying something that was rather up to date, rather high fashion.
The Plus 8 is the flagship model, you understand. It's far gruntier than the lesser type, the 4.4 or the Plus 4. My opinion of a sports car is, yes, it is one that you can drive to the shops, drive to the office, drive down the pub, and yet that weekend you can, with minor modification, rattle it around the racetrack at vast velocity and have fun from it. And when you think of the history of Morgan cars, it was founded upon competitive success. In the early days, members of the family would have been sent out on a Friday night with instructions to go and win trophies over the weekend, and not to bother coming in again on Monday if they hadn't done so, you understand. I've raced now for about 10 years. I'm not a very competitive racer, you understand. I do it for the fun of it, and it's not fun if you scare yourself witless or whateverless. I'm a gentleman racer. I do it for a bit of adrenaline flow and going at speed in my car. Sadly, last August at Silverstone, it suffered the attentions of an AC Cobra on the rear end, which did it terminal damage. I had to totally rebuild it, which I finished at 4 o'clock in the morning a week ago today. Jumped in it, drove it down to Dover, over to Belgium, and raced around the circuit at Spa. Came back after the weekend. It didn't miss a beat, drove perfectly.
In the 80s and 90s, the nostalgia boom in so many areas, including motoring, obviously affected Morgan, who presented their cars in catalogues that actually looked as if they were 50s catalogues. The cars inside are featured against 1930s petrol stations, 1930s petrol pumps, and every attempt was made in the 80s and 90s to suggest that by buying a Morgan, you were re-entering that particularly exciting world of motoring of the 30s. You were going to be driving on empty roads, and you were going to be going to deserted country pubs.
I think Morgans are very special. As you probably know, you have to wait 6 or 7 years for one to be built for you. It isn't as though you can go and buy one from the showroom tomorrow. It's built with your name. As it goes around the factory, there's a label attached. It has your name on it. That's a very nice touch. They are very special. There are only possibly 200 or so a year built for the home market, so you're very lucky and privileged to own one.
People often ask me, who styled the Morgan? I say, well, nobody, it just evolved.
And I remember talking to a guy called Freddie James, and he was describing how, after the war, when he'd ceased to be a Morgan agent, he was just visiting the works, and they were there in the drawing office, which was a wall in some part of the works, and they were trying to decide how to make the headlights fit into the four-wheelers. And so he got a bit of chalk and drew on the wall, and that design was incorporated, and that became the headlights for the four-wheelers.
The styling of the Morgan appeals particularly to children. Now, they're people who have no preconceptions of what a car should look like. You can see where the engine is, you can see where the wheels are, you can see where the driver sits, you can even see the spare wheel on the back of it.
There's no such thing as a totally new Morgan, in the sense that there are so many design features and techniques that are held in common with the very earliest ones. And for example, the sliding pillar front suspension was there in 1909, original patent, and that's still there today. The wooden body frame and metal panelling is there, and certainly the feel of it, like sort of, it's like a sort of glorified roller skate, really, with very hard suspension. It just sort of feels very much the same as they always did. So, yeah, the Morgan character has lived on right from the word go.
We've tried changing the design. My father brought out the Plus 4 Plus in 1963, and it was a much more conventional two-seater closed coupe in fiberglass. And it didn't catch on, but it led to an enormous resurgence in demand for the existing open two-seater.
I must say, even myself, I've seen a car a long way away come forward to me, and I thought, well, that looks rather good looking, you know. And bully, when it comes by, it's a Morgan. And really, I have thought that quite genuinely. To continue making them is definitely a tribute to my father. I think you'd be quite satisfied and rather pleased and probably amazed. I don't think you'd believe it.
It is, I would suggest, a genuine classic vehicle, unlike others nowadays that are produced that attempt to recreate this appeal, but have fallen short. This is the genuine item, and it goes like the clappers. Ah!